We're going to get started with our last foundational document video. We're going to be focusing on MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail. So without further ado, let's get started. Document snapshot in general. This is his brilliant defense of nonviolent civil disobedience as a means for creating a better America, a more just America for all of its citizens. Remember, this is a response to a letter he had received from a white clergyman that kind of called into question some of his motives and methods. So this is King's response. In addition, other than touching on nonviolent civil disobedience, he also discusses the reason for drawing national attention to a local, state, or regional system of oppression, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. He discusses the difference between just and unjust laws. He also discusses justice and injustice as a result. And he discusses the expression of constitutional rights to secure African Americans' civil rights. Okay. First quote that I wanted to look at deals with this idea of maybe this being a document that you could use for federalism. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. This is a federalism argument. In pursuit of justice, it's a federalism argument. So kind of remember where this is placed chronologically. This is the only foundational document that's post-ratification, post-1700s, okay? So this is the idea of federalism made manifest. The fact that we are one united group of states. We are one country. And regardless of whether you're born in Georgia or whether you're born in New York or whether you're born in California, you have an interest in defeating injustice in different pockets of America. So this very much speaks to the kind of that idea of federalism being used and the reshaping of federalism as a principle, particularly following the 14th Amendment. That citizens can go to the federal government for relief when states are oppressive, okay? And this kind of federalism idea is something where if you word it correctly and you argue correctly, you might be able to argue or use this as an argument for increased federal authority within that relationship between states and the federal government. 4 steps in a nonviolent movement. MLK discusses a collection of facts to determine whether injustices exist. So you have to make sure that injustice is actually there. You then have to negotiate with those in power, with the majority faction. So the minority who's being oppressed will negotiate in good faith with the majority, kind of list their grievances, discuss a path forward. If negotiation does not go well, the demands are not met, the oppressed are still being oppressed, then you move to self-purification, which is where the minority faction, in this case racial minorities, are responsible for kind of making sure all their ducks are in a row, that they're doing everything they need to do, kind of that they're above reproach, so that their movement won't be lost in, kind of questioning their motives. And lastly, you then take direct nonviolent action, civil disobedience, marches, boycotts, sit-ins, to create a level of discomfort so that those who were unwilling to negotiate in good faith during the second step are forced to negotiate now and grant those minority factions, in this case, again, racial minorities, their rights, okay? Another quote here that I think is pertinent or could be used in your FRQ deals with the oppressed. Okay, the idea that freedom's never voluntarily given by the oppressor; it must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed. In the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation, for years now I have heard the word "wait" rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost meant never. we must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. This idea that in order to get your constitutional rights, especially those rights that have been denied you, you do need a degree of agitation, and you do need to put the majority faction in an uncomfortable position. And that's kind of the whole tenor of this document, is that core idea. The difference between just and unjust laws, super important. Could definitely see you having to use this as an argument for how layered the response is and kind of the different ways you can take this argument. These are all direct quotes that I'm going to put on here, so feel free to use them if you need to. He goes through and lists a just law as having the following three characteristics: squares with the moral law or the law of God, uplifts human personality, and is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. These are all direct quotes from the letter, okay? He goes on to classify unjust laws in completely the opposite manner, and he has one additional important piece that I want to discuss. An unjust law is out of harmony with the moral law, degrades human personality, is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. This is segregation, okay? And lastly, is inflicted on a minority that as a result of being denied the right to vote had no part in enacting or devising the law. That's a very important principle that MLK makes here in regards to an unjust law being made by an overbearing majority that has complete political control, and therefore minority rights aren't taken into account at all. This screams factions. This screams Federalist Papers, particularly Fed 10, even Fed 51, even Fed 78 and Fed 70, because every single one discusses factions, okay? So this is that idea of majority versus minority factions made into codified law, all right? And then lastly, last big quote that I wanted to focus on is dealing with not just the law being just, but the application or the execution of a law being unjust. He says a law can be just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, requiring a permit. There's nothing wrong with requiring a permit. But when you create that ordinance, or that ordinance that's totally fine and just, is used to maintain segregation, deny citizens their First Amendment privilege to peaceful assembly and to protest, then that law is being used. It's being executed unjustly. So this is a key point that I think you could absolutely use for an argumentative essay about not just laws and laws, but also the importance of justice in the making of a law, the drafting of legislation, and also the execution of that legislation, okay? It's beyond just Congress making a law. It's also about the executive and the bureaucracy enforcing that law in a just way, okay? So keep that in mind as far as, promoting the status quo or promoting the majority opinion or majority idea, and needing to instead be kind of reflective of minority rights. My best guess for, it's not Fed 78, letter from Birmingham jail, sorry, could be used in an FRQ about equal protection clause within the 14th Amendment, the right to peacefully protest through civil disobedience, oppression, the difference between just and unjust laws, or a discussion of justice and injustice, majority versus minority factions, and how the majority use codified laws to suppress the minority, and how the minority can use protests and their constitutional rights as a mean to bring about change amongst the majority. Okay, so that idea of factions. Federalism, it's a bit of a stretch, but that idea of not being a foreigner in any state of the union, that idea of bringing national attention to a local system of oppression, that idea of injustice anywhere being a threat to justice everywhere, that is very much a pro-federal government viewpoint. And it's one of the core principles why we adopted a system of federalism that creates this centralized authority, particularly after the 14th Amendment with, selective incorporation, the Equal Protection Clause, all of those things that increased federal authority. And then obviously anything dealing with racism, civil rights, equal rights, or equality, this document touches on all of those topics again and again and again. Okay. So can you think of any more potential uses for the document? Let me know. Best of luck in studying. It's crunch time now, and I'll see you later. Bye.